Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather on Tuesday, August 23rd, 2022. I'm meteorologist David Percy. And up first on the hazardous weather graphic, a wind advisory remains out until this evening, early this evening. I think it's due to expire at 7 p.m. Tuesday evening. There for the eastern Alaska range for possible gusts to 50 miles an hour. And probably if you haven't seen the 50-mile-an-hour wind gusts yet, you probably won't. Delta Junction was reporting wind gusts up to about 30 miles an hour this afternoon. That's one of the normally windier areas there. And again, that ends this evening. And then over the Kenai Peninsula, that portion of the Kenai Peninsula, the flood advisory continues for actually through Saturday. So the entire week into the first day of the weekend, or through the first day of the weekend. And that's out for minor flooding possible along the mainstream of the Yukon River. And from there, satellite imagery showing kind of a break came in across south central Alaska today. Had some sunshine. Kenai Peninsula breaks right up into Cook Inlet. Other areas saw some light shower activity, but rain for the eastern North Gulf Coast there with about a half inch falling in Prince William Sound during the daytime today, give or take there. And just under half an inch, or right around half an inch, also falling over at Yakutat, and up over the northwest interior along the Yukon River, actually. Caltech also had about 4/10 to just under half an inch of precipitation, as well as Ambler up in the Kobuk Valley with that area of moisture there. All of that over the interior, moving from south to north. You can see another surge there, another wave south or east-southeast of Kodiak Island. That's going to increase the rain over the North Gulf Coast tonight, especially over the eastern North Gulf Coast, toward over the Yakutat, expecting heavier rainfall amounts tonight into Wednesday. And some of that may spill up into the Copper River Basin, but it's going to have trouble jumping the Alaska Range there. And then out to the west, flow mostly from the northwest to southeast, indicating a trough axis right along the west coast there, with a southerly flow over the interior and drier northwest flow. Still some areas of clouds, a little bit of moisture there, Pribilof Islands, but nothing very significant. And then a bigger mass of clouds starting to push in toward the western Bering Sea there and western Aleutian areas. Also some clearing over the southern panhandle today. Allowed temperatures warm into the 70 to 75 degree range over the southern southeast coast. 72, for example, at 3 p.m. in Petersburg. Stewart, the warm spot, with 77 degrees. And Fairbanks had some sunshine with those downsloping winds off the Alaska Range. They were up to 72, and the Nana about the same, maybe about 70 there. Precipitation amounts were lighter over the east side and a little bit heavier, as I mentioned, with that trough over the west and northwest interior there. And also for the North Gulf Coast, kind of a dry day with some clearing over the Cook Inlet area. And along the coast, high pressure, weak high pressure near St. Lawrence Island made for light winds, but not much in the way of any clearing anywhere. Weak system there tried to push some showers into the Pribilofs, eastern Aleutians, but didn't amount to too much. Warm front farther to the west has a little bit more moisture associated with it. And we'll see tonight. That pushes some precipitation into the western Aleutians and begins to start to increase the winds out that way later tonight. The bulk of the moisture and wind still back to the northwest there, the main center over northern Kamchatka Peninsula. Weak high pressure holds along the northern Bering Sea and southwest coast, Yukon Delta coast there, so keeps the whole area there in a light wind dry pattern for areas of low clouds and fog. Could show up anywhere over the eastern central Bering Sea down to the Fox Islands and into the west coast. Weak trough keeps areas of light rain and precipitation going, but not too heavy, but still from eastern Norton Sound up into the southern slopes of the western Brooks Range, but dry, you can see, from northeast to southwest there to the southwest coast. And rain moderate to heavy at times, eastern North Gulf Coast. Some of that tries to slip into the northern panhandle there. Maybe Elfin Cove on up to Haines might see a little bit of light precipitation later tonight, but the southern areas stay dry with that high kind of holding it back to the northwest there. And low clouds and fog for the Arctic coast, maybe a few breaks in the clouds for the North Slope, but still mostly cloudy conditions. Periods of rain at times for Kodiak Island. Winds not too bad there. East maybe up to 20 miles an hour at the most. And for the day Wednesday, tomorrow, look for rain, heavy at times, eastern North Gulf Coast as that front pushes northward, and there'll be a wet day across the southern and eastern Kenai Peninsula into Prince William Sound, into Turnagain Arm and the Chugach Mountains. Looks like Anchorage right on the edge of the western edge of the precipitation area there, with rain and showers into the Copper River Basin and the Matanuska Valley. Susitna Valley may be dry west of the Talkeetnas. Definitely dry for the Kuskokwim Valley with some sun breaks right up into the Tanana Valley again. Upper Yukon Flats, same thing. North Slope, dry, light winds, maybe some sun, and low clouds and fog. Central eastern Arctic coast. Might see some clearing on the west side there. And that front kind of trails across the central Aleutians there, bringing a chance of light rain or drizzle, fog to that area, starting to press in toward the Pribilof Islands. Good westerly flow behind that, pushing it along. And we'll see for the day Thursday, but I'll mention for the southern panhandle, another day of temperatures in the lower to mid-70s, maybe even a little higher. And then we'll see on Thursday that westerly flow across the Bering just drives that front right into western Alaska, makes landfall along the southwest coast Wednesday night, pushing it, the rain inland, areas of moderate rain with it, right into the lower Yukon River Valley areas, with rain changing to a little more showery conditions over the central and eastern interior, but still mostly cloudy. Risk of some sun, and that's about it, but be drier over the east side than out there in the west side, with gusty southwest winds, maybe up to 35 miles an hour into the southwest coast. In fact, gale warnings are out for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, or southwest winds sustained at 35 knots. Showers over the Panhandle, showers for the North Gulf Coast, mostly cloudy, chance of showers for south central Alaska, rain for the western Alaska Range increasing throughout the day as that moisture heads eastward. Dry for the Aleutians, not too bad out over the Bering Sea, a little breezy from the Pribilofs up to St. Matthew Island. And the Arctic coast, risk of some showers on the east side, basically dry conditions there. And for the lows tonight, Panhandle 50s, mid to upper, and upper 40s for the Copper River Basin, lower 50s for south central Alaska, upper 40s there in the Susitna Valley, lower 50s Kodiak Island, upper 40s and lower 50s Bristol Bay, and mid 40s Kuskokwim Valley. Highs tomorrow 65 to 70 for the Kuskokwim Valley, and 60 65 in Bristol Bay, lower to mid 60s actually, near 60 Kodiak Island, upper 50s to lower 60s Kenai Peninsula, northern Cook Inlet, mid 50s Prince William Sound, lower 60s for the Susitna Valley and Copper River Basin. And in the 70s again for the southern Panhandle, near 70 up toward Juneau, and near 60 for Yakutat. And for the Thursday morning time frame, mid to upper 50s, pretty mild there for the southeast coast, and mid to upper 40s for the Copper River Basin, lower 50s for the south central Alaska area, near 50 in the Kuskokwim Valley, and upper 40s to lower 50s there for Bristol Bay, lower 50s Kodiak Island. And high temperatures for Thursday afternoon. Looking a little cooler there over the southern Panhandle with increasing moisture, clouds, and a better chance of some shower activity there. So I'll call it 65 to 70 there for the southern areas, and lower to mid 60s elsewhere. And upper 50s, mid to upper 50s for the North Gulf Coast, Seward, and near 60 for Homer. And upper 50s to lower 60s, south central Alaska, Susitna Valley, near 60 Kodiak, upper 50s to near 60 for Bristol Bay. Same thing for the Kuskokwim Valley. And moving along up for Wednesday morning over the northern interior, mid to upper 40s, or 45 to 50 for the lows south of the Brooks Range. In the Brooks Range, mid 40s, and in the 40s for the North Slope and the Arctic coast, warmest there around Dead Horse and Prudhoe Bay. Same thing for Kotzebue, 48 for your low, otherwise lower to mid 40s Seward Peninsula. And for the highs, 65 to 72 for the central and eastern interior north of the Alaska Range, greater Fairbanks area to the Yukon Flats, mid 60s there, and 40s to mid 50s for the north or the Arctic coast. And moving on to lows the next morning, 40s everywhere, near 50 there in the central interior, followed by highs. Trying to push 70 yet in the Fairbanks area, may not make it, otherwise 50s elsewhere. And out to the southwest, morning lows in the Bering Sea, 40s, maybe 50 for Shimia, and upper 40s to near 50 along the southwest coast. And again, Bristol Bay, lower 40s, St. Lawrence Island. Highs 60s inland, 50s over the Bering Sea, and then lows, lower 50s in the southwest interior, 40s to lower 50s over the Bering Sea, and highs in the 50s on Thursday.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And moving on to flying weather, some IFR right along the central and eastern Arctic coast, and then marginal VFR south of that zone. Along and south of the Brooks Range, marginal VFR that extends southwestward across the Koyukuk Valley, Kotzebue, Noatak, on down into Norton Bay and Norton Sound. Yukon Delta down into the Bering Sea. IFR west of Atka, covering the southwest Bering Sea and western Aleutians. More IFR, Kodiak Island, up into Kamishak Bay along the south coast of the Seward Peninsula, Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, and then the extreme north coast of the Panhandle. Marginal VFR central and northern, 3/4 of the southeast coast with some VFR down to the south. And for the afternoon, Wednesday, pretty good VFR for Susitna Valley, Cook Inlet, at least northern Cook Inlet, into the Kuskokwim Valley and along the lower and upper Yukon River Valley to the North Slope, Eastern Brooks Range, looking pretty good. But some IFR, again, southern Cook Inlet and the southern Kenai Peninsula on up into Prince William Sound and all of the North Gulf Coast. Not much change over the southeast coast with the better conditions south, lower to the north. And west central Bering Sea, IFR that extends down to the north side of the Aleutians there. Otherwise, southeast Bering, marginal VFR in areas into the southwest interior, northward across the western interior to the southern slopes of the western Brooks Range. North Slope VFR and marginal VFR now for the central and eastern Arctic coast. It's Thursday morning, we've got pretty good conditions there for the Arctic coast and North Slope and eastern Brooks Range VFR into the central interior on down into the Kuskokwim Valley, but south and east of the Alaska Range. Marginal VFR in areas across all of, right on down into the Gulf of Alaska, Kodiak Island, and the Panhandle, mostly marginal. A little bit of VFR into the Bristol Bay, then a zone of IFR there from the Bering Strait coast, Yukon Delta, Nunivak Island to the eastern Aleutians, and then behind that frontal boundary there, breaking out to some VFR for Atka and Adak. And for the afternoon, that shifts eastward, VFR into the Fox Islands for Thursday afternoon, marginal VFR to the west and east. IFR, Kuskokwim Valley, northward through the northwest interior to the Koyukuk Valley, back to the northwest coast and the western and central Arctic coast. VFR holding over the eastern interior, and most of the Panhandle looks to be VFR for the afternoon on Thursday, but the North Gulf Coast mostly marginal. And for passes, Anatuvik, marginal VFR. Split the difference here, a little bit better, optimistically for Adik, and go VFR flying tomorrow through the pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will be VFR on either approach, as will Rainy. Windy, good VFR. Isabel, though, marginal VFR, north side VFR, so the lower conditions on the southern approach. And same thing from Antasta, southern entrance, could see some marginal VFR, otherwise not too bad. And Tanita, marginal VFR at times throughout the entire day. Portage, IFR, especially on the Whittier side, maybe a little bit better to the west, possibly marginal, but call it IFR for now. And for Chilkoot and White, marginal VFR. Freezing levels, 8,000 feet over much of interior Alaska to Kodiak Island, 12 to 14,000 feet over the Panhandle, and also out over the central Bering Sea, western Aleutians. Icing, moisture flowing northward there brings considerable moderate rime icing into the eastern North Gulf Coast, Yakutat area, to go along with the heavier rain, and also into Prince William Sound. And then the next batch pushing eastward there out over the western Bering Sea with the heaviest icing north of the Aleutians. And looking at the jet stream, upper level trough right through the interior, a couple of low centers, Kodiak Island up over the northwest or the northwest part of the state. And so 100 knot northerlies across the western interior there, Seward Peninsula, the Alaska Peninsula, south 105 knots into right across Yakutat. 9,000 feet, lighter winds, south 50 knots there for the eastern North Gulf Coast, 40 knot winds across the western Copper River Basin, southwest 40 up over the northwest interior, and westerly 70 knots coming into the western Aleutians. 3,000 feet, not much, you got a narrow band of 40 knot winds there just east of Yakutat. Otherwise, increasing winds there over the western Aleutians up to 50 knots, 60 knots toward the Komodorskis. Turbulence, considerable moderate chop spreading eastward throughout the day to Adak Island, extending back to Shimianatu. Maybe some isolated moderate chop there east of Yakutat and along the North Gulf Coast. Otherwise looking pretty smooth across much of interior Alaska as well as the coastal zones.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and joining me once again is Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Eric, welcome back to the program.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
And once again, you brought some wonderful satellite pictures to show us and do a little show and tell about. It's just amazing. I can get lost in satellite pictures all day. What did you bring today?
Right. Well, weather satellites, what are they good for? Yeah. Of course, there's the pretty pictures that they bring us. You know, we've got a picture here from April of 2012. Okay. The Sumi NPP satellite, it's what they call a polar orbiter, which means it covers Alaska because we're near the pole. Beautiful image. You can see a storm off of southeast Alaska, the sea ice along the Bering Sea up into the Arctic. A really nice picture, and this is important because it allows a forecaster to see where the storms are, where the ice is, where the clear areas are. You need to know where the weather is now if you're going to forecast it into the future. Exactly. So satellites give us these good pictures. This is called surveillance of the weather. And you know, that same satellite also has another picture from a little more recently, August of 2014, Tropical Storm Iselle bearing down on the Hawaiian Islands. Okay. Hawaii doesn't get hit by a whole lot of tropical storms or hurricanes. Sometimes it does. And here's a picture from the same satellite, the Sumi NPP Polar Orbiter. It shows Tropical Storm Iselle approaching the Hawaiian Islands from the southeast. You can see the storm swirling away there, and then there's the Hawaiian Islands. This is a tropical storm, not quite as strong as a hurricane because we don't see the eye wall in there. This is still a serious weather system. And all of this information comes just from that satellite picture. It's so much information, and it's wonderful to look at. You see the beauty and the awe of nature right there depicted in that weather satellite. We call it a polar orbiter because the satellite flies high over the globe. Maybe we could look here at we happen to bring the planet Earth with us. This is our satellite. A polar orbit flies really close to the Earth, maybe 800 kilometers over the Earth, and goes up over the pole and then back down, and then the Earth spins under the satellite as it goes by. That's in contrast to the geostationary birds, which are much further out. And they don't view Alaska quite as well. So we love those polar orbiter satellites here in Alaska.
So when we're a lot closer, we get much better details and imagery and an idea of a better maybe position of what's going on when it's passing right over Alaska or right over Hawaii.
Yes, exactly right. The polar orbiter gives such a good view of places like Alaska. And because it's close to the planet, there's another aspect of satellites in the polar orbit that is helpful for weather forecasting. It's an aspect that's maybe not as immediately obvious as the pretty pictures that we see. And that is the capacity for the satellite to produce what's called a sounding. That is finding the vertical profile of temperature and moisture in the atmosphere. We've all heard of weather balloons. Weather balloons are launched here in Alaska twice a day at a number of airports, everywhere from Barrow to St. Paul Island to Kodiak, Anchorage and Fairbanks, Yakutat, a number of places. Launch these balloons, and we've got a picture of a balloon being launched at an airport, and the balloon goes up. It's pulling a little package, an instrument package with it that reports temperature, pressure, humidity data back, and we use that information to help feed what are called numerical weather prediction models.
The models.
The models, right. It's a mouthful, so we just call it the models. And these computer simulations, these models are computer programs that simulate the motion of the atmosphere. Well, how does a model know what the future will be like? You have to tell the model what things are like now. And you give it all kinds of information, including information from these satellite sounders. Very important. Just how important are they? We have a recent, comparatively recent study that really brings home, and this is Superstorm Sandy. We have a track image here of the track of Hurricane Sandy. It was down in the Caribbean around Cuba, and then it moved north over the ocean, offshore of the eastern seaboard, and then at the last minute, Sandy made what's called the left hook. It turned hard to the left and slammed into New Jersey. Was a major problem for the mid-Atlantic states, a calamity. It fused with another weather system and became known, this is not an official title, but Superstorm Sandy. It was quite the weather event. Well, the modelers, after the event, there's a group of modelers in Europe. They have a very good model, a frustratingly good model if you're the Americans trying to pursue their excellence. They reran their model afterwards in what's called a data denial study, where they kept everything the same. So this is 6 months after Sandy, but they went back, they reran the same model, they fed the model the same initial conditions, that is telling the model, okay, here's where we think Sandy is, down near Cuba in the Caribbean. Everything was the same as it was in the real forecast, except they didn't let the model know.
No satellite data.
No satellite data. So we're going to put that over here, no satellite data for you. The resulting forecast 5 days out, back when the real Sandy was happening and the model had the satellite data, the forecast was pretty good. We've got a graphic here on the left side. We show the forecast of where Sandy would be, and that's the red bullseye on the left. It's just south of where it actually wound up hitting. Not a bad forecast from this computer simulation, 120 hours out. On the right, you see the same model, but it didn't have the satellite data to help it understand things. And the storm is way offshore. It misses. The forecast is more accurate when the model has the satellite data. So that's the idea today we want to convey, is weather satellites. They're important because they show us the pictures of where storms are. We see good examples of this. Yeah, the surveillance right now, it's great to look at those pictures. And in addition, behind the scenes, maybe not immediately obvious, but the models have to have that satellite data for them to be good forecasts. And then a meteorologist uses that information to help everyone with the forecast of where the storms will be in the future.
That is fascinating information that we can look and see where things have been, because you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. That's that old adage there. But seeing that satellites are actually helping us move forward in the weather information system is pretty amazing stuff.
You bet.
And if you want to check out Eric's satellite images that he's been talking about, whether that's something from today or last week or even much further back in Alaska history, you can easily do that yourself. Go to www.gina.alaska.edu and you can find those images there. Eric, thanks so much for joining us once again. And again, we will join you hopefully again soon for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, where you'll tell us more really cool information about the satellites over our heads in Alaska. Thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, looking at the coastal water forecasts, marine forecasts on the south coast of the Panhandle. South winds 15 to 20 knots, seas up to 7 feet. A little breezier and windier up to the north there. We've got east-southeast winds at 25 knots for small craft advisories on the north coast, with seas just under 10 feet. Lighter, more variable winds over the inside waters. South 15 for Lynn Canal, southeast 10 for Stevens Passage, and northwest at 15 knots for Clarence Strait. And the outlook for Thursday, northwest winds continue at about 15 knots there for Clarence Strait. Otherwise, central, northern, and inside channels, winds will be south at 10 knots with 2-foot seas. On the south coast, northwest breeze, or northwest wind 15 to 20 knots, seas at about 6 feet. West breezes at 15 knots from the north coast with seas 4 to 5 feet. Prince William Sound, north winds 15 knots Wednesday with 3-foot seas. And the North Gulf Coast around Middleton Island, southeast winds 20 knots. And for the Barren Islands, east winds at 15 knots, and Kamishak Bay looking at a northeast wind at 20 knots, and Cook Inlet, north winds 15 to 20 knots, 3 to 6-foot seas. And for Thursday, south winds 20 knots for Cook Inlet, small craft advisories for Kamishak Bay, south winds 25 knots, Barren Islands, western North Gulf Coast, 25-knot winds from the south and southwest. And eastern North Gulf Coast, winds will be south at 20 knots, while Prince William Sound will be looking at a southeast breeze at 15 knots. Kodiak Island, variable winds 10 to 15 knots for the day Wednesday, seas around 5 feet. Variable winds at 10 knots for the Alaska Peninsula with 2 to 3-foot seas. And Bristol Bay, east winds 10 knots with slight seas. Big increase in the winds on Thursday over Wednesday. Small craft advisories, the Alaska Peninsula, southwest winds 30 knots, seas up to 10 feet. Bristol Bay, south winds 30 knots. And Kodiak Island, southwest winds increasing to 20 to 30 knots with 5 to 8-foot seas. For the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, variable winds at 10 to 15 knots with seas running 4 to 6 feet. Central Aleutians, west to south winds 15 to 20 knots. And then it's a little more organized out west, southwest 30-knot winds for small craft advisories, west of Adak to Shemya. And for Thursday, southwest winds 30 knots continue for the western Aleutians. Central Aleutians, west winds 25 knots. In the Fox Islands, west-southwest winds 25 to 30 knots with 8 to 11-foot seas. For the southwest coast, 15-knot winds, variable along the Yukon Delta coast, south for the Kuskokwim Delta coastline. Pribilofs, variable winds 20 knots. Small craft advisories for St. Matthew Island, south winds 30 knots, and south winds at 20 knots for St. Lawrence Island with 4-foot seas. And then Thursday, winds increase even in Norton Sound, looking at small craft advisories there for south winds at 30 knots. Same thing for St. Lawrence Island and the southwest coast. Gale warning south of Nunivak Island. Southwest winds sustained at 35 knots with 10-foot seas. Small craft advisories, the Yukon Delta coast, southwest at 30. And for the Pribilofs, winds will be southwest at 25 knots with 11-foot seas. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, Wednesday, east to southeast winds 10 to 15 knots with 4-foot seas. Southeast winds 10 knots on the central coast, western Arctic coast, east winds at 15 knots. And from Wales to Cape Lisburne, winds will be south at 15 knots with 3-foot seas. And for Thursday, from Wales to Cape Lisburne, southeast winds 25 knots with 5-foot seas. And from Cape Thompson to Cape Beaufort, looking at east winds at 20 knots, western Arctic coast, east winds 15 knots, and then 10-knot winds from varying directions for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coastline, with seas pretty slight there at about 2 feet, up to 5 feet there from Wales to Cape Lisburne. And for the time frame tonight, low clouds, fog along the Arctic coast, otherwise not too bad over interior Alaska. A lot of rain-free areas there along the Kuskokwim Yukon River Valley areas into the Tanana Valley. Rain on the increase for the eastern North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound into Kodiak Island, southern Cook Inlet, to a lesser extent over the northern Panhandle. And front out west pushes eastward on Wednesday, but just a weak trailing edge bringing some moisture into the central Aleutians there. And the main low center hanging back at least through tomorrow. And still a risk of some shower activity along the lower Yukon River Valley and up over the Kobuk and Koyukuk Valley areas. Basically, right on the edge of the showers there for Cook Inlet and the Susitna Valley. Rain heavy at times with the eastern North Gulf Coast. And for Thursday, widespread rain comes in with that front pushing across the Bering Sea from the Alaska Peninsula north to the western Arctic coast. More showery and lighter precip to the east.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.